Very big warm welcome to everyone who's here this evening, especially those of you who've come for the first time to be here. This talk is hosted by the Archives at NCBS. This is the 57th edition of the Archives Public Lecture Series. And for those of you who are here for the first time, this public lecture series is a set of monthly talks framed around explorations in and around archives, which includes discussions by artists, archivists, academics, lawyers, teachers, journalists, and others. We are really excited to have with us here today Dr. Peggy Mohan, and she'll be talking about migration and the making of language in South Asia. And to do a really quick introduction, before you begin, Peggy is a visiting professor at Ashoka University, Delhi. She began life in Trinidad and the West Indies. She has a PhD in linguistics from the University of Michigan. She has taught linguistics at Jawaharlal Nehru University and Jamia Millia Islamia, among other places. She has contributed to reputed publications such as EW and others. She's also the author of 3 novels. Her latest book is Wanderers King's Daughter. And earlier this year, it won the Mathatuni Book of the Year award. And she also informs me that she's working on a new book. Yes. Yes. So greatly looking forward to it. And without further ado, here's Peggy.
Let's see if I can preface this by giving you some sort of a context. I assume that very few of you here are going to be linguists, and you don't want to hear about language for its own sake. You probably want to see how it links up with other things, which may be things that you're doing in the hard sciences, in archaeology, in genetics, in pure history, looking at the written record. What we tend to find is that each in itself is a little incomplete. And here is one more source of data which can help to flesh out what could have been history. And in this case, since it's such a rich subcontinent, the history of South Asia, you don't do that going into the dark without a flashlight or any kind of a compass. So the compass that you use, as in a lot of sciences, is a model. So the model has been something that one has been through this book that I wrote, and much more in the book that I'm writing now, where I'm very happy to see that events in ancient India or the pattern and language evolution in India is a much better guide at times to how things have happened in the world than the things we've accepted from Western scholarship, like there were pidgins and there were creoles, and then came, some move towards a standard language. But in fact, some of the old models that we had, that there was something called a prakrit. Where does that fit into it? So that linguistics can give you a means of adding in little detail into data, which is sometimes very, very bald, like genetic data. And I'm going to try to see if I can do that now. So I'm going to take you back as far back as I can go. And as far back into the past as we can go is probably, what does this say? Wrong. Let's go back to first Indians. First Indians, you see a nice date of 70,000 years ago, which is the approximate date that geneticists have given us for when the first migration happened out of Africa. The people who left Africa at that time, crossing from Ethiopia, Somalia region, did not go to Europe and to the rest of the world. They crossed in an ice age. Ice age simply means, some of you know this already, that yellow arrow is not going to be the one that we're looking at, which the Europeans tend to think of as the first migration out of Africa. No. At this time, 70,000 years ago, you couldn't cross the Sahara Desert. It was a desert. However, the place where people crossed out of Africa would have been relatively shallow because a lot of the ice was held up in the glaciers, the polar glaciers, and maybe glaciers elsewhere. So the first Indians were in many ways the first people out of Africa. So our history goes back somewhat that far. These people, all my maps are hand-drawn. And that's a sketchy line because it was probably more inside what is now the nation right now. Initially, when they came to India, now, how long did they take to get to India? That's a very important figure. The geneticists tell us something like 5,000 years in transit from where they crossed to when they reached roughly the Indus Valley area, which is the beginning of South Asia. 5,000 years is a very long time to make that journey, which allows me to say it was not a migration. These people were not migrating. They were not going anywhere in particular. They were spreading out. Why were they spreading out? Because they saw animals and they saw vegetation that the animals were feeding on, which encouraged them to keep going. So since they were not going anywhere in particular, but simply moving, we don't call it a migration. That's very important because one of the things that you find is that this was the migration into India that brought the maximum percentage of women. Women are very reluctant migrants, and we will find very few of them in the future. So if there are women in India and population in India, and India always has been an attractive place for migration, it is because of this first bunch of women who came across and were there as potential wives for later migrants. When they came to India, India was not uninhabited. It was inhabited by hominids, but not humans. So we're going way back to the first migration out of Africa. What does that tell us? What can we say about the people who came? How did they speak? Obviously, that's a hugely long time. I am reluctant, even when we have the best possible evidence, like in the Andamans, to say there has been no change. But there are a few things that we look at which seem to have endured. One of them I would look at is grammatical systems. The languages were more complicated than the languages we have now, much more cross-marking. Those are the things that seem to have remained. So early human language was not simpler, it was much more complicated. But here's one thing that you're going to find that's familiar to you, to every one of us. This is the same map. You see, if you look earlier, you're getting it ends somewhere on the right. I haven't taken it further. Here I have. I mean, I've colored and shaded all the places where you get one thing that has to have been in the first Indian languages, which is there in almost every part of India except Assam, which probably did not get it, and the far northeast, and that is something called retroflexion. Retroflexion is very simple to understand. I know Hindi, but I know it's in every language of India. And whichever ones it's not in, it was in it 100 years back. Okay. Retroflexion is like the difference between the word dant, tooth, and dant, which means scolding. The and n are not the same as the and n. That's very unusual in the world. There are very few languages that have this. Once you get outside of South Asia, you're not seeing it. But if you go beyond South Asia, you begin to see the central New Guinea, which had the same migration as first Indians. It was not a population replacement. Or Australia. If you hear Australians speak, many people say they sound like they're speaking Tamil. And they do. They say na or la, ga, and they're talking like, it's sounding like Uttanad and Punjayelle. So that kind of sound. And okay, so we don't see it outside South Asia, but we see it there. which tells you that the one that Australia only had its contact with India and Africa in that first migration. So it's fair to say that even though we like to say that these sounds are Dravidian or South Indian, they're not only South Indian. They go back to before there was anything remotely resembling a Dravidian. And some parts of India, as you can see, like them more and developed them more. And some places they faded out a bit. Look, you see the lines going into the Andaman Islands. So the Andamans also had this. Why have I chosen sound? There are two things that tell you a lot about the past. They're not words. Words are the easiest thing to change. This morning, what I was wearing was different from this. I look different. But what did not change was my genetics, my bone structure, various things inside me. So we are looking at language in terms of what cannot be changed. You could just erase all the Urdu words and create something called Shuddh Hindi. You can take Malayalam and stuff it full of Sanskrit words, but the genetics of the language is going to endure. So we try to look past the words and see what the genetics are. And we see in Ethiopia and Somalia a certain proportion of this and maybe not the others, maybe the rest was lost, maybe it was there once. We see, we look into Australia, we see it. Central New Guinea just turned, Andamans turned, tribes turned, and they have a. And crazily enough, if you look, I could have taken that dark brown line further north. Punjabi has the kind of features that South India has. So this is apart from, and it has of course other things too, like how many of you knew that the Punjabis cannot say herd, herd. It does not exist in the language. They have problems with it, they avoid it. So you begin to see already through just looking at sound, some kind of a picture of who we are beneath the clothes we wear and what we pretend to be at the moment. Now, what is retroflexion? You may wonder about it. Everybody who's done phonetics has seen this thing. The green is it's dental, it's behind the teeth. The orange is it's curved backwards. By the way, R is not retroflex. So I'm up for grabs onto where it came from, when it came, what it's doing in the South Asia, but it's not retroflex, it's something else. So we're still really only looking at and up in the far northwest, into Pashto country, into Sindhi, into the Karakorams, there's a sh, which is also in Sanskrit. Yeah. Okay, so in the middle is a white tongue position, which is behind the alveolar ridge behind the teeth. So it's a t. It is neither nor is it the. So many languages tend to either choose one of these positions and stick with it. Malayalam, of course, has to tap all three. I don't know how they survive, but the point is, South Asia is known for mostly having these two positions. And that, as I said, takes us back to history very far in the past. It takes us back a good 70,000 years. It's pre-Dravidian. So these are the sounds. I don't need to go into it. It's interesting that exists, and because it's not in Sanskrit. It is in Punjabi, but yes. But it's not in Sanskrit, but it was in the Prakrits, which tells us even Sanskrit at some point had to approach these sounds when they came into India. And every single migrant group that came into India, their children started using these sounds. Why? Well, let's see, we'll come to it. Yeah. Quick glance, only two white spots there. Those are two Munda tribes which should have had turn, turn, in contrast, they don't. But if you look at the data from 100 years ago, which exists, they didn't seem to have it there. Yeah, I mean, they were beginning to waver. So 100 years is nothing in the context of 70,000 years. So a very old feature just began to fray at the edges somewhere there. Quickly, you see much more in the south. Why, I'm not very sure, except I have a mistake. You notice that L in brackets? That one can go a bit higher. It's in Punjabi. Sardinar. Yeah. So, or Northern Dravidians. So, until then, we were only talking about one group. Now, let me take it back and discuss when you have only one group, which slide is this? Numbers, which my second page. Yeah. So, what happens after this? There must have been migrations into India, individuals all along. But we are not interested in the little man who came and settled down and fitted in with his neighbors. We're interested in the ones who leave a genetic trail, who change the politics of the country, who force small formations into larger formations, create kingdoms, and so on, who had more technology. So we're looking at the empowered migrants who came in. And the first ones that are of note on the genetic record are the people from the Zagros Mountains in southern Iran, the Iranian farmers. And they had a few things going for them. Obviously, they had domesticated crops. Also, I saw the question, why did they come? One student once asked me that, why would they come? Farmers don't move. I suspect that men generally do move. And there's enough evidence from looking at them genetically that this group were mostly men. What do you do if you're a man and you migrate into a place like South Asia? You either go extinct because men do not have uteruses, they just do not have children by themselves. Men, in fact, when men make up languages, men make up pidgins, and those also die with them. So the point is, what makes durable languages? So obviously then moving on into families. And how do you have a family if you haven't brought women? So you have a set of relationships that come up, and initially in the Indus Valley, between the early hunter-gatherers, the people who we call the first Indians, who by then had obliterated the other hominids and ruled the country. We don't know much about how they ruled, or how varied they were, or what all they talked. Some of their languages still exist. You can tell a bit. But then they met these slightly more developed people from the Zagros Mountains. So who are the Dravidians? The Dravidians are neither. The Dravidians are actually both. So it is what you get is a kind of a fusion that happens very typically when men migrate into a new place and meet local women and have children. So the children are a fusion of both sides. And both sides simply means that these are the migrants are the men, and the mothers who bring up the children until the age of 5, give them their first culture, their first language, their first notion of what sounds should be in contrast to the other women, and they are local. So there's this continuing foundation in the Indian population of the early women. But here come these men, and together they form what was probably not called anything like Dravidian. It's a very relatively new word. It's late Sanskrit, by the way. It's not even a South Indian word. It's a useful word because the Brits took it and used it to describe two different sets of languages. However, these people were the proto-form of what would have become Dravidian languages. What were these languages like? We actually don't know anything about what these men brought in, because as far as I can make out, there's no other part of the world that has a link to the languages that we know now as Dravidian. Where? So did they all come to India? We don't know. There's a lot that we don't know. However, the people who made the Indus Valley civilization were the result of a kind of fusion and something very unique to South Asia and to that part of South Asia. Now, why did they move? I suspect that the success of their culture, not climate change, but the success of their culture is that once you have farming, you have a surplus population. And a huge population means one thing in migration terms, that a large number of young men are ready to move. So they may have moved not because they weren't getting, or they were not able to survive, but because suddenly they want room to live. We see this all over the world. We see it in the animal kingdom. I'll show you more of it. So they moved on because of the population surge, and we don't know what happened to the rest of the Zagros Mountains in terms of language. What kind of language would they have made? Well, the grammar and the sounds, all these lovely things, would have remained from the woman's language. But the beauty of a man's group, an empowered group coming in, is they donate that very visible thing called the vocabulary. So you would have got a vocabulary based on first Indian languages, which were already still being spoken in their pure form in other parts of South Asia, but they got a new vocabulary on top of it from the kind of men who participated in this fusion experiment. Now, as I said, pigeons are not a part of our model. They may have existed somewhere in India at times, but if you have, part of what I promised to tell you is what happens when people can't speak to each other. Obviously, ad hoc languages come up, but when you have a situation where the migration is permanent, it's not like a trading situation between one group of hunter-gatherers and one group of settled farmers or wishing to settle farmers. When you have permanent migration and taking local wives, you get a new generation which learns the mother tongue. We have a lot of populations in the world elsewhere, in the Caribbean, for example, where centuries ago, men came in and killed all the men in a tribe and married the women. And to this day, boys are brought up speaking a different language from the girls. These things somehow seem to persist. However, they do tend to fuse, and the thing that prevails tends to be the mother tongue. The grammatical structure that remains in whatever goes on tends to be from the maternal stream, and the paternal stream tends to be the one that this gives the vocabulary. Let me take it forward. I'm sure this will mention it. Look at the top. Who can't say bhad, her? Two parts of India. Interesting. It raises a very big question. I'm not going to answer all the questions. I don't know the answers. Why is that white center in the middle? Why can Maharashtrian say bhad? Why can tribal Gunda say it? I don't know. But the point is we have a similarity which continues from the very north in the Indus Valley down to the south in grammatical features, some of them, and in some of these sound things. So I have a dream of someday sitting down and writing out a Punjabi song with the Tamil nouns. And seeing how it sounds. I suspect it will work very well. In fact, your son-in-law, when he went to Japan, he used to speak Japanese, and when he didn't know a word, he just put in a Tamil word. And the Japanese thought, maybe it's a technical word we don't know. It worked. It worked very well. Okay, why do males migrate? I went on a migration myself a few weeks ago, to Masai Mara, and I wish this was one of my pictures, but it wasn't so focused. This is not a clone picture. This is called a Thompson gazelle. And we were going by, and we had a most wonderful guide who really was knowledgeable about a lot of deeper issues to do with animal herds. And he said, this is a bachelor herd. And the word bachelor is a familiar word, like in the West Indies, male migrants from India were called bachelors, Muglasias is translated as bachelors. Bachelors means that the men who went, even if women went for them to the Caribbean, were usually not even their wives, just some stray woman who's bold enough to go. But here, this whole herd is male. What's going on? We went on a few more steps in the jeep and saw a fully female herd with one alpha male with huge horns in charge and one youngish male on the fringe. And our guide says he's about to be driven out of the herd. So here is an interesting thing. This is not a distress situation. This is basically the nature of how this particular social formation goes. So there's such a thing as a surplus male. So the continuity of the herd is the females, and the alpha male himself will one day be deposed. So the idea of men migrating, leaving their families, leaving and not ever planning to return is something that's not merely human. So when people ask them, why do women not migrate? I can't answer you because I see it with bears, I see it with gazelles, I see it with a large number of animals where it's very normal for the male to migrate. And that's an important thing to bear in mind because that explains quite a lot of how India was settled. It's not just, we're going to keep going, and everywhere we look, we're pretty much going to see bachelor males coming into a new territory and finding probably herds of women, surplus women too, I don't know. Let me see. So how does this evolve into a model? All our lives we've been told that such and such a language is descended from this. This language is descended from Sanskrit. This belief that there's a single descent line or ascent line or whatever you wish to call it, and that it goes up like a tree and it diverges into branches, and there's no way the tree next to it is going to have a role to play in how this tree develops. So you say then that Hindi is an Indo-Aryan language. What does that mean? Nobody here, you may all have family surnames that go back to your father, if you're from the north at any rate. But that's not your only parent. So quite a lot is not being addressed in the idea of a single lineage that you belong to. There is something more like two lineages. Now, I'm very sorry you've seen this little animal before. In my book, I talk about a tiramisu bear. Tiramisu bear, there's only one way you will get. Tiramisu bear is my daughter's word for this hybrid of a polar bear and a grizzly. How do you get tiramisu bear? There's only one way. You cannot have a polar father because the polar father will never leave the ice cap to go south to find a mate. He cannot walk on barren ground. So the only creature that could possibly move is the grizzly. and the grizzly female, being female, does not migrate. So the only way you will get this kind of fusion is a male grizzly going north, maybe because he's waking up earlier, and unfortunately in the same time as the female polar bear's mating cycle, he goes north and finds that there's no ice floes. These things are on land. He should not be meeting her at all. So he meets her, they have offspring with a characteristic set of features. For example, the paws will be something in between a grizzly set of paws and polar bear, somewhat furry. If you've ever seen these animals' paws, they don't slip on ice. And if you ever owned a pair of boots made by Inuits in the far north, you can run on ice. You don't need cleats. They are basically they've got fur happened to them. So that's why they can run, but they therefore are very vulnerable on regular ground. So here you have this kind of animal that's a metaphor of the kind of languages that get created in migration situations where the mother is local and never moves, and the male has come into that area. Now, okay. This is not the only migration that we've seen in India. We have another migration which happened before the Vedic people came to India, just slightly before, 4,000 years ago. 4,000 years was a very important time in South Asian history because that was the time the Indus Valley collapsed. That was the time this migration took place, and possibly around the time the South was settled. So it's a very landmark time. But here came another migration from the east. How do we know it was male-driven? We know very little about it. The linguists thought 100 years ago they heard something like Vietnamese words in the tribal languages of Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, the Munda, Santali type languages. What are these Vietnamese, or to some extent Thai words doing there? And they let it be. There are some other things archaeologically that made them think that, yes, there are people similar to first Indians in that area. It's true, there were, but they were killed. They're not there anymore. But what happened was there was a migration. The geneticists recently worked on exactly when Japonica rice came into India and found that that was 4,000 years ago with a bunch of men who came in. They shared their genes with local women. I hesitate to think of whether that was a pleasant thing or not, or whether men got killed in the process. Did the men run? What happened? But there is a certain amount of quite a fair amount of genes from Southeast Asia in our tribal population in this area, not in the south and not up in the far north. So it's all on the male line. But when you do the same test looking at the mtDNA to see the maternal line, you're getting like 0. They essentially brought no woman, and then they came in. And what did we get? We got languages which don't look anything like Southeast Asian languages, except for having some vocabulary. So again, you see that the maternal line holds steady, and you have the kind of old tribal languages that were always spoken. That to this day you get whiffs of them in the Andamans and so on, but you don't get any of the tone type things you get in Southeast Asian languages. We did get one thing from the Southeast Asians, which is interesting. Since tribal people probably did not have such developed number systems, when you import a new notion on numbers from an incoming migrant group, you import other things with it. There's a kind of a gender system that comes only with numbers in the East and all over Southeast Asia, China, Japan, Korea, Tibet. It's there now in the entire eastern part of India. Anybody here knows Bengali ekta? That's comes from Southeast Asia. And ekon, ekjon, it has the highest form of differentiation in Chinese and Japanese. But so you see something could leak in that is more substantial, but a few words leaked in. But otherwise, you got a continuation of the kind of old grammatical structure. So India is getting populated. So far, we have seen two sets of males coming in. The people who created the Dravidian family and the Southeast Asia. To this day, linguists love to say that the tribal languages of Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh are Austro-Asiatic languages. Now that blows my mind. 2 minutes ago, you were saying they were first Indians. Now you're saying that they're actually Vietnamese. Now you need a model which knows how to reconcile. Yes, they are both. And they're both in a particular way. We imagine that the number of men who came into a huge land like India cannot have begun to compete with the population already in existence here. The women would always have outnumbered the men. And the local populations, not all the men were decimated. So you got an influence from outside, but a huge continuity. Let's see if we see another. We know this one, right? This is the Vedic people. Again, male-driven. How do we know it's male-driven? Again, the geneticists. So we would not have known about the migration from Southeast Asia if the geneticists hadn't discovered by testing out the tribes in Jharkhand area, Munda-speaking tribes, that they had a strong line of Southeast Asian genes. We wouldn't have known exactly what was the nature of the influx of Vedic people. We call them Vedic people. I assume not all were writing or composing Vedas, but the point is we do know that initially when people were trying to say, okay, so like people came and brought Sanskrit. In those days, we only had the mtDNA tests and they did not show up on it. All we found is that the history of India was continuous for untold thousands of years, more than 10,000 years, maybe 12,000 years, maybe more. Who were these people and did they come at all? And then when we tested Y-DNA, which means you can only get the male descent line, they suddenly discovered men had come. Now, why am I telling you about the Vedic people? Because they are, for me, a very useful form of doing something which matters to me, which is getting enough data to improve the model. They tell us a lot about how things happened. So you again get a situation where we know a bit more from the Rig Veda. We know a bit more about a lot of memorized stuff that was not written down. And we are aware of them saying things about so-and-so spoke Prakrit. They knew our language, but they weren't us. There were certainly men who picked up the Vedic language. We don't know exactly what they spoke like when they were not composing the Rig Veda, but the Rig Veda I'm referring to because it's the earliest. There's quite a lot of influence in later Sanskrit. We don't want to look at where it's already been influenced. But we are assuming that when Sanskrit first came into India with these men, there was no they were not there. we find when we look carefully, we see how they came in. 700 years later, it was discovered that let's note these things down. And by then, people had in their Sunday rules and so started using them quite a lot. And this was noted down. But even so, what nobody tells you, if you look at a page, now you can see visually of Sanskrit, of Rigvedic text. There is but very little of it. So it's not only a matter of whether it's there at all, but how much of it is there. The further south you go to Maharashtra, there's quite a lot. You go to Kerala, there's an awful lot. So you're seeing something that is increasing. And if you look at the Prakrits from the north sound like some Malayali was trying to recite Sanskrit and bringing in an accent with very little other changes and accent difference. So the Vedic men came into a place where people had sound systems, grammatical systems, which are similar to the kind that we now find in the South. And because their children grew up with these Prakrits and the original languages as first languages, it began to leak into the way they spoke Sanskrit, the way they even composed in Sanskrit. And why? Because unlike other languages like English and Persian, it was not written. So over centuries, left to yourself in what's called a shakha. Shakha in the old days simply meant a family group of Brahmins. They're far off the beaten track, just reciting the Vedas to each other, the first mandalas of the Rig Veda. It begins to change. It begins to adopt more of these Dravidian sounds, what we call now Dravidian sounds. They're actually older than that. So what's beautiful in this is that looking at the entire story of Sanskrit allows us to see how long it took for certain things to leak into the language with population mixture, what kind of grammatical features leaked into Sanskrit that are different from, say, what are there now in the South, makes us raise a lot of questions that, was there something different in the North, in the Dravidian spaces in the North from the South? Were they more happy about gender? Were they more happy about some of the other things that you don't get in South Indian languages now, like the by me food kind of structures that you're very familiar with from the North. So what was good is that this allowed one to refine the model and to think of, let me see if I have spelled it out. Yes, so you have Sanskrit coming in, then are all around it are approximations of Sanskrit, which are, I put it in the same color range, Prakrit, so essentially just Sanskrit with a different accent. You think about it, you get your friends write to you, you read their academic papers, it's a very soundless interchange that you have. And then the minute they decide that they're in a hurry and they send you a WhatsApp voice recording and you hear a Marathi accent that's thick, and you hear this guy's from Kasaragod and not from Cochin, or you hear this strong Bengali accent, and you suddenly realize this is what must have been hitting all the Vedic people, the local accents that they couldn't possibly miss because everything was oral. However, they weren't speaking badly. Anybody from Britain hearing me speak will probably think that this is not English like I learned. But if they saw me writing it, they probably wouldn't have too much objection because it will fit in with international English, and same with all Indian English. There's not much difference. So the Prakrits, the best example of a Prakrit that I can give you is not bad English. it's the English that we speak. So the Brits came, they spoke their English, we speak ours. It's that close. So the Prakrits are not a halfway margin, halfway house between what the migrants brought and what came up later. They're just a nice local people accommodation to a new influx. However, this is the question, the thing that we don't know enough about, but we can guess if in India there wasn't too much interference with very ordinary local people. Remember the IBC culture in this valley, the Harappan culture was already an agrarian culture. It was somewhat developed to the extent that when the culture itself folded, the people were still there. What were they doing? Farmers were not probably going to be interacting with Vedic men in their battles. They were not interacting with even the kings of their own people. If they were left somewhat alone, they were probably continuing to speak their earlier languages. We have no idea what those languages were. They have vanished in the Northwest. But we can imagine that they stayed around until at least 500 AD, maybe a little later in some cases. So here's the model. Sanskrit and the Prakrits, just locals who meet them and learn the languages very well. That's the first step, not a pidgin. Then, meanwhile, they're all still speaking the local languages. Later, because of other forces in the society which cause either proximity or maybe over a very long period of time as the population grows and gets absorbed into the new culture, you start seeing what's called vocabulary replacement. The thing that we call English in the North, and you must have words for it here too. You begin to see vocabulary leaking in without an attempt to do more than simply replace vocabulary. And it's easy to see in the tribes in the Munda area, because if I can read the data and I'm not lost, it's because words from my own dialect, which is right next to there, are leaking in. I'm familiar with it. So there's a slow, gradual process. And after a certain point, when people begin to want to either write or they begin living in towns or whatever, you start finding that it accelerates. Then you have these languages which have a very different grammatical structure. Maybe the old grammatical structure is still there. The words have changed. That's a description of almost every language of North India. The North India has either the old Munda type languages of the East, onto which came new Prakrit words, not Sanskrit. The Prakrits were close enough because those were the little rulers in the small areas. Then, or in the Northwest, every single, not just nouns, every verb, every ending. If in Tamil you say vehicle in the house, correct? Yeah. In Sanskrit you can't say that. You will say ghare or grahe. Grahe and a is a locative case ending. We don't have cases. We say ghar mein. May is fulfilling. May has come from some Prakrit source, but what is may? May is basically ill. It is completely replacing an earlier notion on how you string words together. So you have the old agglutinative structure of a Dravidian language, but we've pulled in Sanskrit type Prakrit words to express the same things. So when you say that Hindi is from Sanskrit, or it's from the Prakrits. You haven't understood that ghar mein is actually vehicle. So this is a good example to show, and we have a number of others in other areas of grammar. Okay, so you're seeing the vocabulary replacement on top of what was there before, creating these mixed languages. These mixed languages, the model that one appeals to is the Creole model. Again, the Creole model is it's a layered mixture. The grammar and to some extent the sounds remain from something else, the words from something else, from the migrant language. Am I going a little too fast into, you can ask me questions later. Now, this is not the only one we have. Okay, this is something I made. This is my terrace. So here I once referred to this as an image of Malayalam, but it's as much of an image of any North Indian language too. If I ask you what you see when you look at this picture, you will tell me you see probably an octopus. But the thing is, it's a floor. And the octopus pieces are not a floor. They don't have any substance. They can't stay there. They need a matrix. And the matrix is the cement and the white stones that you fail to see because they're not as interesting as the image of the octopus. So to think of it in terms of Malayalam, you immediately, the Sanskrit words leap out at you. But in fact, long before there were Sanskrit words, before there was an octopus terrace in my house, there was a white floor, and it worked very well as a floor. So the only way this could work in is if there was cement, and that cement we take for granted. That cement is the grammar that holds it together, and it's very interesting that a matrilineal system, the word matrix, which means cement, is that thing that binds the language, and so easy to overlook. And that the old philologists who worked on Sanskrit and old Indian languages were obsessed with words, and the words are these fellows who can't even make a floor by themselves. So to see the completed floor, you have to understand how they fit with something that was there before, and that's prepared to hold them in place. Now, where am I going? I'm not even looking at my notes. So when you get to the end, I put a different color for Sri Lanka because it's too iffy as to what color I should have made it. But green is the migration from Southeast Asia, with all the Ekta Duta and Ekjon, and Assam, of course. In Assam, there's many more. Why? Because they're adding to it. Things are not static in this world. In Bhojpuri, in my dialect, there's only one. We don't even, Ekjon kind of faded out at some point. So we have Nepal. Oh, I haven't got to that yet. I wish I could tell you what I'm going to write in a few months, but I'm going to work on Nepal. Nepal is a crazy place where, because of Tibetan influence, all the impossible things are there together. You know, so do I dare to call that chapter the duckbill platypus of South Asia? No, but it is. But here, look, we're all the way down here, and then Maharashtra, and this is a very funny configuration. Ignore it for a moment, because at the bottom of the Indo-Aryan zone, we have a twilight zone where we have Dakhini and Southern Marathi, where the influence of Telugu and Kannada has done some very interesting things. So don't think about them too much yet. However, this huge area is one kind of North Indian language, which we think of as having a Dravidian base, but not exactly the same base as the South Indian languages. A few things are not there, a few things are different. And then we have the northeastern zone. These areas are tribal areas a few hundred years ago. So these are modern languages. When did they come up? Okay, how do modern languages come up? How did these languages are not modern, they're old. In some ways, they're older than the languages of like Sanskrit and Prakrit. So they are the languages of what I call the little people who held on to the old grammars and brought in new words from the Prakrits over centuries. But how did these come to be the languages that we know? Because there's another time in Indian history that's extremely important. 4,000 years ago is important. The 12th century is very important. 12th century is when pretty much all the North Indian languages and even Malayalam in its present form came into existence. And you need to know that it has nothing to do with grammar, syntax, verbs, nouns. It is a political thing. What was happening in the 12th century that allowed the little people to unseat a huge order of people who were operating the land in Prakrit and Brahmins still working in Sanskrit? What happened? And I've been trying to think of what it might be from. Is it that they overthrew Buddhism? What happened? And slowly looking at things like what happened in the Bangladesh area, what happened in the Deccan. These languages were there below sea level, not written. Writing started, but more important came the Sultanates. The Sultanates had no reason to love the old Prakrit order. And if there were people around who wished to experiment with things called Bengali in its more modern form, Dehlavi, Hindi wasn't called Hindi, Dehlavi, the dialects of Braj, Awadhi, early Marathi in its many forms, the Punjabi type dialects. If there was anyone who was willing to give them a space and help them unseat the Prakrits, it was the new Sultanate. So it takes nothing less than political backing to change an old order. So I'm giving you a fast glimpse of how am I doing time-wise?
Yeah, out of time.
Huh?
We're out of time.
We're out of time. Now I'll just show you the last. Yeah, let's go. We are out of time. Again, these men from Uzbekistan. We believe that there were some women here and there. Again, a male-driven migration of people in the Sultanate, the Sufis who came, later the Mughals. Again, and they unseated the earlier Prakrit-based spread of power across the land, where little people were somewhat below sea level, not seeing the light of day. Here's the last slide, you don't need to go with it. And just to capture you that we're back to the present somewhat. Who are these other people who came? Forget the French, yes, they came, the Portuguese. Mostly men. The British, when they came, they had one interesting thing. Younger sons. These were the bachelor herds who came to India. They couldn't have done very well in Britain, and Britain was fully exhausted in terms of what their opportunities were. They were very glad to have a place like India to come to. Women did not come until the Suez Canal was built. So you had the initial influx of British into India was no different from the other stories. And interesting, what are the languages in India which stand out as not being part of the pack? Sanskrit doesn't look anything like an Indian language. Persian doesn't look Indian. Ahom maybe, yeah, English. all the other languages which have evolved and fitted around accommodate these age-old pressures of that maternal base across the land. Now, you see if this makes sense to you. This is how I am structuring my model. I'm going to be taking it forward because I want to look at, for example, how did the South get settled? And as far as I'm concerned, why would it not have been men from the Indus Valley slipping south? But I haven't reached that yet. But I have to use my imagination to see what is possible before I start looking into whether that is what happened. Because we're so far back in the past that the data is very sparse and we have to know where to start looking for it. I'm going to stop here because I can see I'm out of time. Am I very badly out of time?
Well, we have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions.
I
And
don't
then,
have as many questions as you want.
and then people can join us for chai and refreshments outside.
Okay. Will you feed them? Or
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you've answered a lot of questions in my head about my own language. I speak Malayalam. So loan words in Malayalam when I was studying Spanish, mesha, mesa was the one thing that table. It came from Portuguese and Spanish and all of that. The one thing that I've always found as a problem for me in learning other languages is the conjugation of verbs taking into consideration not just, so we'll just look at past tense. Okay.
beautiful.
Okay.
I'm so glad you said this.
I have thought about this since I was 7 years old because I struggled to learn Hindi because of this, which is conjugating verbs using gender and number. Malayalam is very easy. It's the same word.
Malayalam is too easy. In fact, it's shockingly easy.
So
And
easy.
something, it shouldn't be so easy.
I don't know why it is. The pronunciation, I guess, makes up the difficulty.
No, you got rid of a lot of the endings.
And for me, I feel like it still conveys a lot of the meaning. For example, the example I use is he came, she came, they came, ayadu vannu, avadu vannu, avaru vannu. It's the same one.
But not in anywhere else in South India.
Yes, I thought it was a Hindi thing, and then when I came to Karnataka, I'm starting to learn Kannada. Avan banda, avadu vandu. It's very difficult. So
Something happened in Malayalam around the 12th century. It's not a very old thing.
yeah, so my question is, why is that so? Because even in Spanish, they do accommodate
Yes.
for numbers and gender when you're looking at the same tense when you're speaking. But if you can speak to what happened in Malayalam where it became so simple.
I'll talk to not just Malayalam, because after all, the Northern Dravidians have this issue too, which is to say the Punjabis and the Sindhis and the people in the Karakorams and so. I'm glad you asked this question. It's a question I really think is the most interesting of the lot. I have a theory that South Asian thinking processes are very noun heavy. They hate verbs. There are a lot that we were talking in the way back in the car. You can't like something. To me, there's like and like is a noun. You know, there's quite a, and if you look at conjugation, you can have these long interchanges. Kaha jana, kab jayenge, kab jana. We don't conjugate the verb at all. So, and in South Indian languages, the verb to be can be just thrown out. The first sentence of a paper reads like it's heading. You don't know if it's a heading or the first sentence of the paper. There's something in South Asia that dislikes all this kind of, the kind of verbs that you get in Sanskrit, the kind of verbs that you get in Spanish, the kind of gender system that you get there also links up in a very funny way to a choice that was made. What do you want to do? Do you want to conjugate verbs like you were talking Sanskrit? No, you do not. So let's make the verbs into nouns or adjectives. If you make a verb into nouns and you say I, not I do, but I am a doer. Are you a female doer or a male doer? Suddenly gender becomes an issue. if you say food eaten by me, food eaten is an adjective. Adjectives will agree with nouns, but that's okay. But if the noun is a gender, the interesting thing is that the Indus Valley area was more happy to deal with gender than it was to deal with what you're talking about. They hated the verb conjugations, and pretty soon they started knocking them out of the Prakrits, knocking them out of Sanskrit, and bringing late Sanskrit somewhat more in line with what the modern languages are, which is what we're talking about. But in the north, it was done at the cost of bringing in gender. Because I am a doer and you are a doer, we are not the same gender of doer. Do we have gender? Well, it seems that there was something in the north that did not mind it. There's something in the Deccan that does not mind gender. There's something in southern Maharashtra, they hate saying, "By me food eaten," it's I ate, but they don't mind gender. So gender is the less of the evils, but the verbs they just do not like. So it's a very interesting feeling. And what is an ethos? I was asked by a friend to edit a manuscript she wrote, a science fiction book. And I said, okay, great, I'll get a chance to see data, to look at Indian English data. All over the place, I would underline places, things that I would have written as a verb, she wrote as a noun. They were worried because of the advent of Diwali, because Diwali was coming. You know, you look at Indian English, it's very Prakrit. That's Prakrit I mean. All over where you can use a noun to say I needed a man for definition and something else to define me. Hello, you don't want. So there is a dislike of playing with verbs. In Spanish, it's the opposite. You can't land on the moon because the moon is land. The moon is not land. Land is earth. So you have to moon on the moon. You make a new verb. So what you asked is raise a little on its nest, because gender somewhere in the middle was seen as something we could live with. But we don't want those verbs. So even in Sanskrit, by the time of Kalidasa, you're seeing these texts where it's reading like Hindi to me. I'm looking at this, is this Sanskrit? What is it? When Shakuntala says, by sharp pusha grass, my foot pierced. There's no is. And pierced is an adjective agreeing with foot. You know, even in classical Sanskrit, they're taking the verbs and say, make it into an adjective. And they, guess what? Has to agree in gender. So you have a choice. Do you want it to be full of paradigms and all the things you got in the Rig Veda, or do you want to deal with gender? Because somehow there has to be some kind of thing that shows agreement. I don't have an answer, but in the north, gender did it. In the Andamans, gender does it. In even the tribal areas in the far north of Bihar, some kind of classification did it. We didn't mind gender. And even in the south, except in Kerala, people don't mind saying he, she, and it. And oh yes, and when you go even further north into the Pashto area, southern Afghanistan, verbs have gender, but adjectives don't. So verbs and gender are seen as a nice compromise. We don't mind doing that if we didn't have to conjugate verbs. We hate verbs. So you're getting a sense of an Indian thinking, which is much larger than just one language. Yeah.
There are one very happy comment, like as a Bengali, these things resonate in very different levels. One is about the verb thing. I think even now Bengali poetry, the poets say that you are using too many verbs. So the roundness of the poetry is going right. It's better use adjectives and all. So that also shows the mindset. And I think this 12th century thing, I think Bengalis didn't like saying dynasty and all the oppressive that Brahmanism. So
Yes.
they one time actually in many of the folklores they were actually praising some of the Islamic kings and equating them with some of the deities. Yes. After the
I don't have the, you would have seen some of this that I sent to you. Brahma, Hoyle, Pegambar.
yes,
Those are all Bengali songs.
they actually they are now freeing us from that. So that is a very interesting thing. Ma'am, the question is, whenever someone tries to guess this linguistic ancestry and all, like we are like always this very famous word by Colin Masika about language lakes props up. There might be a very huge body of unknown language. So can there be a very huge body of completely extinct language that is having no trace? Because sometimes I think while going through the data that is building that idea on, we see that many of the Bengali words for say that particular lentil, like mashpalai, kolai, that kind of words are not completely missing. So whenever there is a etymology, missed etymology, we see that many of us are not really represented that this word so much. So what is your comment on it?
See, Colin Masika, his early work was like Southworth's work, where they were looking for which words came from Dravidian and which words came from Proto-Munda, which into the Sanskrit. So they're trying to trace using that. At some point, he got a little bit of a better idea. And he started saying that we look at the structures, which is the same sort of thing that I'm doing now. He's seeing below the words. Language X is a word. Now, language X is a term attributed to Nick Massacre when in a conference in 1883, something like I can't remember the exact year, but in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Language X is that language we don't know about. That all the words we don't know where they came from language X. So I took that word and said, language X is that unknown language we know must have existed in the Indus Valley. So I'm trying to, my chapter 3 is In Search of Language X. So X, he never used the term language X. Everybody attributes it. He just said unknown. As anybody who knows mathematics, unknown is X. So that everywhere he listed as unknown, people call it language X. But I think that we needed to, I mean, you can do quite a lot looking at things like this, but that doesn't ultimately get you very far. The only thing, it's like when you dig up an old grave, you're not going to see the features. You're not going to see the face. You're not going to see the clothing. You will see the bones, and you may pull out some DNA if the bones are fresh enough, ancient DNA. And so I like to look at the bones because the bones we know at least are there. And the bones for me is the grammar, and to some extent the sounds that if you can trace them. So why do I do that and they don't do that? Because they're historical linguists, and historical linguists are a tradition that looked at, oh, this Aryan word in Sanskrit is there in Persian, it's there in Russian, it's there in Latin, it's there in Greek, and they were very excited by that, not knowing that you can take this only so far. I don't understand, you don't have to understand Bengali if you know Marathi, but you can pull out a lot of words that are similar. That doesn't tell you anything. What is more interesting is what the bones tell you. So I have to stay with the bones because at least they're there when you dig up the graves. So is that a kind of an answer to you? I basically stay away from what I can't answer. So it's not a kind of answer at all, which is what were the words in the Indus Valley language? They're gone. They're gone. let's look at their books.
We do need to wrap here. I will, I mean, this is the conversation that will definitely continue on the side. There's team thanks for everyone. Just a quick thank you to everyone for coming here on behalf of the archives of NCBS. We are a public collecting center for the history of contemporary science in India. The archives, if you would like a tour of the archives and if you would like to visit, it's just around the corner. If you go out the door and around there, down the stairs. Please do visit the archives. We'd love to have you. Let's all, and thank you very much to Peggy for this really wonderful talk. And this is something that we continue outside.
And I hope some of you will answer the question. When did you know about South Africa? You have to unhook me or I will go.